Hey yo guys, I'm back to reading this story, Fresh Ex Female Reader. Chapter 2. Okay. You stood on a floating island and looked at yourself. You were waiting for ink. You sighed and looked around the doodle sphere. Most of the floating islands were grassy and had some flowers. However, in the distance, you saw what looked to be a forest, or just multiple islands with lots of trees, resembling a forest. Jim teleported next to you. You turned to him. Isn't ink... Jim cut you off. He wants to show you more advanced magic first, but it's easier to start with the basics, so I can teach you some magic for a few weeks, he said. You nodded. He smiled and walked a few feet away from you and got in a position. You watched intently. Okay, Ryan, do is exactly as I do, he said. You got in the same position as him. Okay, so this is just practice. In an actual battle, you need to be ready to use your magic at any time. But since this is practice, I found it easier to do beginner magic in this position, he said. You nodded. He did a motion and summoned a bone attack. He turned to you. Now you try, he said. You did the same motion, but nothing happened. Jim smiled and shook his head. It's not just the motions. You need to activate your magic. Here, close your eyes for a second and just focus your energy to the palm of your hand, he said. You did as he said, and he continued. Okay, now think of something to attack with. Like a bone, he said. You did, and he told you to open your eyes and do the same thing as before, and to summon a bone and sent it in Dream's direction. He grabbed it easily as it was moving at a slow pace. Now you're getting it. Kinda, he said with a shy smile. You gave him a confused look. What's that supposed to mean? You asked. He sighed and scratched the back of his skull. There's about 125 bone attacks known so far, he said. You stood still and inhaled deeply, then shouted, How many? You looked at him with shock. He nodded, rubbing his arm. Yeah, it's a lot, he said. You groaned. Dream sighed. Well, you're not going to learn by standing around all day. 2 months later. You sighed, sitting on the ground. So far, you've learned all the basic attacks and a few advanced attacks. But all that added up to about 25 attacks. Ink walked over to you, looking down at you. Oh, come on, don't be like that. You still need to learn how to use a caster blaster, he said. You ran your hands through your hair, looking at the grass. Ink, do you really think I'm ready to do a boss monster level attack? You asked, looking up at him. He frowned and sat in front of you on his knees. Why are you asking me this? He asked. You looked back at the ground and sighed. Ink, I've been practicing the same attack for a week, and nothing has happened. When something does happen, it literally falls apart. You hugged your knees. Ink placed his hand on your shoulder. You looked up at him. He smiled softly and stood up, extending his hand out to you. You took it, and he helped you onto your feet. You looked at him. He smiled and looked at a few small pieces of islands. They were like stepping stones. All the islands had these in between them. The times they didn't was when the gaps between the islands were small. Ink led you back to the island the house was on. Blue came out and outside and greeted you both. Hey guys, Fresh was just here, Blue said. Ink sighed and smiled. Cool. A bit sad he couldn't meet Lion, though, he said. Blue nodded. Yeah, hopefully he can meet her next time, though, he said. Ink nodded and looked at you. How about we go to Undertale for a bit? he asked. You nodded, with a smile on your face. It almost reminded him of a child. He chuckled and used his paintbrush and opened a portal, and you both walked through. 2 hours later. And also in this story, most days are on the surface. So, continuing on. You were on the couch in Classic Sans' house. Ink was talking with him in the kitchen about you staying here when other Star Sanses were all back in their AUs. Classic looked over to you for a second, then back to Ink. I don't know. This house is already kind of full as it is. If they can get a job in this AU, maybe. But then she'll have to move out eventually. And there aren't very many houses here that are vacant, he said. Ink looked over to you. Hey, Ryan, could you come over here? He asked. You nodded and got off the couch, walking over to them. Ink placed his hand on your shoulder. Okay, Ryan, if you were to get a job in this AU, what would it be? He said. You thought for a minute. I dunno. I'd probably try to get a job at the cafe down the street, he said. Ink smiled and looked at Classic. He sighed and leaned back slightly. Well, I guess in that case she can stay. But I have to make sure my bro and Frisk are alright with it. Papyrus will probably be alright with it. Frisk, however, they have some trust issues with humans, he said. You tilted your head, but aren't I technically half monster? I mean, I have a human and monster soul, so... he said. Classic Sans sighed. That's just it. No one is supposed to know that. So if you stay here, no magic unless it's necessary, he said. You shrugged. I can barely even use a few bone attacks, other than beginner level stuff, he said. Ink's pinpricks looked to the ground, and he tilted his head in the opposite direction of you. You paid no mind to it, not realizing how rude that may have been. Basically telling Ink he's a bad teacher. That may not have been the intention behind it, but that's how Ink took it. Ink sighed and looked back up at the two. So, Classic, would you mind teaching Ryan how to use a Gaster Blaster? Whenever she tries, it falls apart, he said. Classic looked at Ink, then at you, then back to Ink. He sighed. Alright, I guess, but only in the doodle sphere, he said. Ink smiled slightly and nodded. Alright, thanks, Classic, he said. Then he turned to you. Come on, Ryan, let's go. Okay. Oh wow, this is a whole lot shorter than the other one. To those of you who did watch the other one and then came over to this one, thanks. If you watched the video to the end, thank you. I appreciate it. Well, I would ask you to like and subscribe, but that's like, I don't know. I hate this phone. Yeah, I'm gonna record chapter 3 right after this, so